From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, so it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. Of course, if you're a regular listener, you know this is when we get you updated on the news that made headlines this week in our region. And today, our panelist includes Kevin Richer, senior reporter and blogger with Idaho Education News, Ruth Brown with Idaho Reports, Ian Max Stevenson with the Idaho Statesman, and Nate Sunderland, managing editor of EastIdahoNews.com. Hey, everybody. Happy Friday to you.
Happy Friday.
Hey.
So, hello. So, the election, it is less than 3 weeks away. So, some big issues on the ballot here in Idaho, including a ballot initiative. So, Ian, I want to start our conversation today with that. Let's begin with Proposition 1. Can you tell us a little bit more about, if this passes, what this initiative would actually do, but also what it would not do?
Yes. So Proposition 1, I'll try to explain this as succinctly as I can, would basically have two big changes to Idaho's elections. So first, it would get rid of closed primaries. Right now, for instance, if you're not a Republican, a registered Republican, you can't vote in that party's primary in the spring. And so what this proposition would do is, instead of having separate slates of candidates for each party, there would instead be one big primary. Sometimes this is called a blanket primary, that all candidates, Republicans, Democrats, Constitution Party, Independents, etc., will run in. And in that election, voters would pick their favorite candidate, and then the top four candidates would advance to the general. That's when the other big change would take effect. So in the general election, which is what we've got coming up in a few weeks now, if this reform were to pass in future general elections, instead of just picking your favorite candidate, you'd have the option of ranking candidates. So maybe you love candidate A, but you'd also be okay with candidate B. So you put candidate B as your second choice, and so on. Then when the votes get tallied, if no candidate has an outright majority, so 50% plus one of the votes, the last place candidate would get eliminated. And if they were a voter's first choice, that voter's votes would go to those voters' second choice. And that process will continue in a couple of rounds until candidates get a majority. So those are the kind of two fundamental changes that it would bring to Idaho's elections. And as listeners have probably seen, there's been a lot of debate about this measure, which I'm sure will continue up to Election Day. I see signs all over the place these days, which is all well and good. But I think it's important that voters also have accurate information about this reform. And I do think there's a fair amount of misinformation out there about some of the things it might do. So, for instance, I've seen some people say that this reform would take away people's ability to vote for very conservative or far right candidates. That's not true. Far right candidates, as well as far left candidates, as well as moderate candidates, like they do today, could all run for office. They could all launch campaigns, and people could vote for them. And then another claim I wanted to point out that I've seen is that ranked choice voting systems are somehow less secure than our current system, or are somehow rigged. That's also not true. It is true that the tabulation system under ranked choice voting is quite different from how it's done now, and it is a bit more complicated. So if this were to pass, I'm sure it would require education for voters to learn how it works. I certainly needed to learn how it would work when I first heard about it. But I think there's a claim sometimes that it involves some kind of shady shenanigans behind the scenes. And that's not really true. Just like other types of election systems, there are rules that determine how votes are counted, and those rules lead to winning candidates.
And I think one other thing to point out, Ian, is that there are other states that have ranked choice voting, correct?
Yes, there aren't a ton of examples, but yes, for instance, Alaska has a pretty very similar ranked choice voting, as well as blanket primary system that they've had for about 3 or 4 years now. Maine also has ranked choice voting in some of their state elections. And there are a number of municipalities like New York City and some cities in Utah that also use ranked choice voting for local elections.
And I believe there's about, I think, 6 states, right, that have this on the ballot this year, correct?
Yes, Idaho's not the only state that's considering implementing a change like this. Colorado, Nevada, Montana, Washington, D.C., and then there are also some other states like Arizona and South Dakota that are considering other changes to their primaries that are sort of similar to Idaho's, like adopting a nonpartisan primary. So yeah, there are a lot of states actually in the coming weeks that are considering kind of big changes and reforms to their elections.
And one thing that I find interesting about this debate is that we've heard quite a bit from folks who are in opposition of this, is that it makes it so that you've heard, well, Democrats just want to get in on the Republican election, right? It's not fair and all of this. What's interesting to me is that in Nevada, they are looking at a very similar ballot initiative, and in Nevada, Democrats are the majority. Democrats are in power, and Democrats are saying the exact same thing as Republicans are saying in Idaho. So it seems to me it is when you have a party who is in power, doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican, you want to keep that power.
I do think, yeah, I've definitely seen, party states that have a particular party that's strong are often opposed to ranked choice voting because it does, I think it's probably fair to say that it's likely to reduce the strength that any particular political party has because they kind of are no longer running their own primary where they get to pick, their voters get to select the candidate that they want to proceed to the general. It's more of a kind of broader process where people would be picking from a larger slate of candidates, and you could even have multiple candidates from the same party advancing to that primary. You could have 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat and 1 independent make their way into the general election. So it'd be a pretty different system.
Which is historically what you see in the state of Washington, actually. I mean, they only have it's only 2 candidates go on to the general, but historically, it's usually 2 Democrats that you see in that race, whichever race that is, right? A statewide race. With that said, Kevin, I want to bring you in onto the conversation too, because you wrote some analysis about Proposition 1, and you stated that it would fundamentally restructure elections in Idaho. And you also wrote about the fact that we have definitely not seen the last of the campaigning on this issue, even though we're 18 days away from Election Day and early voting has already started.
Yeah, no, this is going to go down to the wire, and it really kind of goes to what you and Ian were just talking about. Republican Party has really gone all in on this. This has become their kind of all-consuming issue, this election cycle. Dorothy Moon, the state Republican Party chair, has been railing about Prop 1 for weeks and weeks. Tom Luna, the former state Republican chair who was ousted by Dorothy Moon a couple of years ago, he's out on the, around the state campaigning against Prop 1. You had Mike Moyle, the Speaker of the House. This is really interesting. And Idaho Capital Sun first reported on it this week, and I reported on Thursday. His PAC put $241,000 into anti-Prop 1 campaigning. Now, that's actually relatively small compared to the amount of money that Prop 1 supporters have brought in, largely from out of state. But it gives you an idea, and it goes to what you were talking about before. Republicans in the state really do not want this thing to pass. This has become a priority to them. And it's because, if you're the Idaho Republican Party, you control every statewide office. You control the entire congressional delegation. You have 83% of the legislature. Those numbers are not going to go up much from there. I mean, you kind of hit your plateau here. So any kind of change to the election structure is potentially something that might cut into the Republicans' supermajority. And I think that's a big reason why you've seen the party go so all in on this issue.
Well, and also, Kevin, it's interesting to note, though, that there are Republicans who are in favor of Proposition 1. You have former Governor Butch Otter. You have Bruce Newcomb, I believe, who
Yeah,
has
you have
been in
Jim
favor of
Jones,
this.
former Attorney General and state Supreme Court Justice, who's a Republican Attorney General back in the day. Yeah, so it's not unanimous opposition from all
Hmm.
Republicans, but the Republican hierarchy has definitely made this a priority. And that's what's really interesting about initiatives and why it's really kind of hard to figure out whether this initiative is going to pass or not.
Right.
The infrastructure of the Republican Party, that's a powerful force in Idaho politics. But you have to also remember that initiatives are kind of born out of frustration. Initiatives get on the ballot and voters vote for initiatives because they're ticked off at the way things are going and they want to send a message that they want something different. And I almost wonder if for some voters, if you have all these Republicans being so adamant against Prop 1, does that kind of make some voters say, well, I'm going to I'm going to tell them to stick it. I'm going to vote for this just to spite them. So initiatives are tough to read. And this one, a lot of money, a lot of campaigning, and we're not done yet.
Yeah, and it's one of these things too, that on the flip side of people who, I mean, for folks who are wanting Prop 1 to pass, I mean, when you look at Idaho historically, elections, at least statewide elections, are won in the primary. I mean, that's just a fact. If you win the Republican primary, you're going to be hard pressed to lose that election come
Yeah,
November.
absolutely. I mean, we'll talk later about some legislative races that are actually going to be up for grabs in November. But you're right. By and large, most primary elections kind of settle what the legislature is going to look like. And it certainly settles the differences between the conservative wing of the Republican Party and the more mainstream wing of the Republican Party. So, yeah, primaries are definitely the race to watch in Idaho
And you
and have
have
been for a long time.
Right. And you have someone, let's take a former Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeehan, who won the primary to become the Lieutenant Governor by 28%. I mean, 28%. She got 28% of the vote in a closed Republican primary, and she went on to win the general election. So,
Right.
In fairness, I think that is why there is frustration on the side of people who are for this initiative.
Right. That's part of the argument that you hear is that somebody can come out of the Republican primary with kind of this narrow sliver of support, become the party's nominee, and then almost by default, they're going to win the general election or they're going to be heavily favored to win a general election. So, yeah, I think, again, this is part of the frustration that is driving the campaign behind Prop 1. It's frustration with the closed primary. It's frustration with the extremism that some people feel has come out of that closed primary over the past decade plus.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that said, I think it's going to be close. So we will definitely be keeping an eye on it. Nate, switching gears a bit, seems like a lot of folks in the Idaho Falls area are not happy about a proposed plan for a new expressway. Talk to us about this because, there aren't a lot of fast moving roads in that area.
Right. You've got I-15 and Highway 20. That's about it. And Highway
Yeah.
26, some smaller ones. But like every other part of the state, Eastern Idaho is growing. And so a committee was put together called the Bonneville Metropolitan Planning Organization. And they held a big meeting this week with the public to talk about the future of the Idaho Falls area, the Bonneville County, Ammon, Yukon area. And they say that they expect the population of Bonneville County to grow 80 to 90% over the next 25 years.
Wow.
And the infrastructure, the roadways that are in place right now simply cannot handle that many people. And so they commissioned a high capacity road study and came up with this idea to build a 4-lane east to west expressway, which would run over basically through Idaho Falls, through Bonneville County. It would be 55 miles per hour. They're calling it a limited access, median separated, high speed road that would help reduce congestion on all of the surrounding roads. Well, as you can imagine, a lot of people have strong opinions about this. At this meeting, there were hundreds and hundreds of people who showed up saying there's no way that the county can have this. It would bring down property values. One guy said that the current plan, there would be an overpass right over his house. Another person said that, it would ruin his property. And, they're upset. They don't like the idea. on the flip side, though, you've got the reality that the area is growing and you have to do something. And they're saying that by putting in this roadway, it could reduce things. It's important to note this is just a proposal, and it would not be built until the growth actually happens. It would have to reach certain targets. So it's not like they're going to break ground next week. They actually don't see it happening for another decade or two, or maybe even 30 years, and they need funding for it. But, it's one of these things that I think a lot of Idaho communities are dealing with. How do you plan for the future? What steps can you take now to plan for it so that you're not caught off guard and there's traffic jams everywhere?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, Ruth, the same day an Idaho judge signed a new death warrant for Thomas Creech and putting in place a new date for his execution, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals sided with Creech's attorneys in an ongoing legal dispute. So let's break this down. Can you first tell us about when his execution date is now set?
Sure. Thomas Creech is Idaho's longest serving death row inmate, and he is now set for execution at 10 a.m. November 13th. Your listeners might remember Thomas Creech was subject to a previous execution attempt that was unsuccessful. IDOC attempted in February to administer an execution, but the medical team failed to establish an IV. They attempted to establish an IV in his hands, arms, legs, feet, but they were unable to establish one that they thought would be adequate. And so the execution was called off. So this would be a second attempt to kill Mr. Creech.
Okay. And so, Ruth, as I mentioned then, so this new date is set November 13th. Tell us, though, about this decision from the Ninth Circuit and what it could possibly mean for Creech.
Sure. So it's interesting that they happened on the same day, but I think it was coincidence. The death warrant was signed in the morning, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals issued its opinions in the afternoon. The appellate court's decision does not stop the scheduled execution, just for clarity. The scheduled execution is still on, but it could pave the way for Mr. Creech's counsel to file a new request for a stay of execution. The appellate decision revolves around whether U.S. District Judge Amanda Brailsford should have recused herself from a February complaint due to her relationship with Ada County Prosecutor Jan Bennett. The Creech counsel asked her to recuse herself, stating that, or alleging that Brailsford had a relationship with Jan Bennett. Brailsford has said that they only occasionally see each other professionally. They did clerk together for the same judge when they were young attorneys, but that was 1993 to 1994. And Brailsford claims, we don't communicate regularly. She didn't call it a close relationship, so she did not recuse herself. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals disagreed with her decision, and said in its opinion that it's clear that impartiality might be reasonably questioned under the unique circumstances of this case. So Brailsford has since recused herself. A new judge will be appointed for this district court case, and it could be relitigated. I did talk to the Ada County prosecutor's office because they're heading the case, and they say the appointment of a new judge does not change the facts. The facts support Judge Brailsford's original decision to dismiss Creech's claim about his commutation hearing, and they are confident that the outcome will be the same with a different judge. But right now the clock is ticking. He is scheduled for November 13th execution. Whether or not the new judge that is appointed will expedite the hearings, I don't know. It's only been one day since the opinion dropped. But it arguably it could be grounds for a stay of execution.
So, Ruth, another thing that you wrote about that I want to talk about is what is being done in terms of making sure if this execution goes through on November 13th, And I hate to use the word successful, but that it would go through and we would not have another situation that happened to Thomas Creech the last time they tried to execute him.
Sure, I understand what you mean. So it's been a busy week. On Tuesday, the Idaho Department of Correction announced a new policy on how executions will happen. And then obviously it was just the next day that his death warrant was issued. So obviously this was had Mr. Creech in mind. Under the new policy, the lethal injection may now be administered through a person's central vein. A central vein is like a major vein in the artery, usually your chest, neck, or groin, and it involves the insertion of a catheter. Prior to this policy, IDOC and the medical team was just administering the medication, the chemicals, through a peripheral vein, those are the veins that are closer to your skin surface, things that you might get maybe a blood draw from or an IV insertion. So they've changed the policy. IDOC has also created what is essentially a medical room in F Block. F Block is the building where the execution chamber is. And through various medical records, or excuse me, not medical records, public records, they are working. I've seen records on the building permits that they are working with things like essentially it's a new medical exam room. It's new lighting, new sink. There's a new water heater, new flooring. I wasn't able to obtain all of the records that I requested, but through the records that I did request, it is clear that they have established and built what's essentially a new medical exam room. There is one change that will be different for execution witnesses, and that is that designated execution witnesses will see live audio and video of the preparation of a condemned person getting their IVs or catheters inserted, rather than witnessing it through the glass, which is what has happened at prior executions. They do this in other states, but it is a change. So witnesses will not be able to see the attempted IV insertions through glass, but IDOC adamantly assured me that live audio and video will be seen of the preparation room where the IVs are inserted. So that's a change that we're looking at.
All right. Thanks for that update, Ruth. So, Kevin, I want to turn now to Boise State University volleyball because we're learning more information from public records requests. Very quickly, though, before we get to what information has been learned, can you quickly tell us again about this issue for folks who may not be following along?
Yeah, if you're just catching up on this. So 3 weeks ago, Boise State University forfeited a volleyball match with San Jose State University, and they've never really talked publicly as to why, but it's fairly apparent that this is part of a bigger debate, a very bitter national debate over transgender athletics, because San Jose State reportedly has a player on its roster that's a transgender athlete. As I said, Boise State has said very little about why they made the decision. They've really said very little about who made the decision, whether this was a decision made by the team or whether it was made by the administration. We've really learned very little from the university itself, but we're starting, and when I say we, I mean several reporters from several news outlets, including myself, have been demanding public records from Boise State to try to get some insight into what was going on here.
So with that said, Kevin, what information has been learned through these public records that they have finally released?
We are learning some interesting stuff, and I want to give a shout out first to James Dawson, your own James Dawson at Boise State Public Radio. He reported earlier this week about some of the process that was going on in the days leading up to the forfeit. And it's pretty clear from his reporting and from the emails that I've received since then that there was definitely discussion among university athletic officials, and it was definitely about this player on the San Jose State roster. So pretty clear that this was what was going on in terms of backstory. On Thursday, Sean Goodwin with the Idaho Statesman reported a really interesting email that I'm planning to work into a story today myself, about San Jose State coming back to Boise State and saying, now hold on, if you forfeited a match with us, we lost out on a home match. We lost out on revenue because we didn't have a match. So we didn't have concessions, we didn't have tickets, we didn't have parking. So we want to be made whole. So shout out to Sean Goodwin at the Statesman. He broke that story. And I'm working on a story today that puts together some more stuff from the public records. I think I break some news. I mean, it's hard to tell because everybody is working on the story. And kudos to Jimmy, kudos to Sean, kudos to everybody who's trying to chase this down. And, a little soapbox moment here. Gemma, this is why we fight for public records. We fight for public records in the media because it gives us insight into things that are going on that sometimes a public agency like Boise State is not exactly forthcoming about. So this is why we are so adamant in our profession about the importance of public records. And I hate being scooped and hopefully I'll break a little bit of news myself today, but it's heartening to see reporters using the Public Records Act to shine a light on important issues and breaking some really important stories. So, shout out to everybody here.
Well, transparency is so critically important, right, Kevin? And that is the reason, one of the reasons why public records are so important. With that said, one thing that I'm curious about, Kevin, and I don't know if the public record showed this or not, but when we had Jimmy on before to talk about this, one of the things that we were discussing was, do we even know who had this concern about playing San Jose State? Because Boise State has played them in the past with this same transgender athlete on the team. And was it a student athlete who had the concern, or did this come from the administration? Do we even know anything more about that?
We might know more later today when my story publishes. That is some of the stuff I'm trying to get at. And I'm not trying to be evasive. I'm not trying to get clicks. But you are absolutely right. That is one of the biggest questions about this is, did the players make the call or did the administration make the call? And if you're watching the situation that's going on at the University of Nevada, you've had a real disagreement between the university and the players about playing San Jose State. So I think we get at some of that. I think we get at who made this decision. And I think we get at some of the political pressure, maybe some of the external pressure that was brought to bear on Boise State in the days leading up to this decision. So, stay tuned. Or if you're listening to this on the 8 o'clock, you will go look at the story. It should be up by 8 o'clock unless I'm working really late today.
Okay. Well, no, and I think that's really good information to know, though, right? It's like who really truly had this issue with it, and then what does that mean, right? So, looking forward to you giving us more information later today on that, Kevin. With that said, I need to make a correction. Nate Eaton is with us from East Idaho News, not Nate Sutherland. Nate, I do know who you are. My apologies. So I have said that twice now.
It's never confusing having two in the same newsroom when people call. We can just, blame it on the other one.
All right, perfect. I mean, I don't have that issue with a name like Gemma, but I mean, my apologies. I said your name, and then all of a sudden, as I'm asking Ruth a question, I was like, "That's not Nate Sutherland. That's Nate Eaton." So apologies. No okay, with that out of the way, this is kind of interesting. Tell us about there's what $100 million generators the INL is creating, and why? What are they going to be used for?
This was fascinating to me. We were invited to one of the buildings out at INL in the Idaho desert, where you couldn't take in our cell phones. We couldn't bring in smartwatches, nothing that transmits, because they're building what are called radioisotope thermoelectric generators, RTGs, and they take years and years to complete. And these are the devices that are powering missions to space. They've built them for Apollo 12, 14, 15, 16, 17, the Mars rover, the rover that's on Mars right now. Mm-hmm. The power generator for that rover was built right here in Idaho. And so the scientists who took us around this facility showed us how they build these generators, why they're not called batteries. A lot of people might call them space batteries. A battery runs out of electricity. These don't. These can power for 100 years, so they prefer to call them generators. But yeah, we have that story on eastidahonews.com. The video, they let us take a camera inside and show everybody how it's done, and it's happening right here in our own state.
Love that. All right. So Kevin, Idaho Ed News is writing a series of candidate profiles that could have education implications for Idaho. We did talk about a few of those races last week. during the Reporter Roundtable. But today, let's focus on District 15 because you write that this race could have statewide impact.
Yeah, this is a really interesting legislative district, and it's right in our backyard because this is West Boise. District 15 is about as purple a legislative district as we have in the state. You have two Democrats representing the district right now and a Republican. The Senate race between Rick Just, who's the Democrat, who's the incumbent, and Cody Galloway, who is former representative running on the Republican ticket. The two of them have raised $250,000 between the two of them for this campaign. That's about as expensive a legislative race as you're going to see. And they faced off a couple of years ago in the general election, just barely won by a couple of hundred votes. This could be a very close race again. And it really does matter because every vote in the Senate is going to matter when it comes to issues like private school choice, Idaho launch. And it also matters in terms of who becomes the next Senate President pro tem. There's a vacancy there because Chuck Winder was voted out in the primary in May. Senate Republicans are going to get together after the election and figure out who the next pro tem is and who ultimately are their committee chairs. And that's going to affect kind of the makeup of the Senate and the tenor of the Senate. If Galloway is a member of the Senate Republican caucus, that, she may have a very pivotal vote in those closed door discussions. So there aren't many legislative races that are that interesting, kind of like we talked about before, but some of them are really interesting. And races in 15 are about as interesting as we've got in the entire state.
All right, we'll keep an eye on that. Okay, Nate, I've got a minute left, but I really want you to quickly tell us about this story, how basically kind of two meddling moms and Facebook got their kids together.
Yeah, Facebook page. There's a local group in Idaho Falls, 70,000 members. About a year and a half ago, a mom went on there and said, looking for the page to find my future daughter-in-law with some smiley emojis. It got dozens and dozens and dozens of comments, including one from another lady who said, hey, I have someone that might fit that mold, daughter-in-law. Turns out that it was her daughter. They got set up. He popped the question a few days ago at a local pumpkin patch, and now they're getting married.
Okay, I have to say, I love that. And so for every meddling mom or dad out there, sometimes it does work out, kids. So, sometimes mom really does know best. I thank you for telling us about that. Love to wrap up on a good note. With that said, a big thank you to our panelists today, Kevin Richards, senior reporter and blogger with Idaho Education News, Ruth Brown with Idaho Reports, Ian Max Stevenson with the Idaho Statesman, and Nate Eaton, managing editor of EastIdahoNews.com. Do folks go to all of their news organizations and read their stories. We are really fortunate to have the journalists in this state that we have. Thanks so much for listening to Idaho Matters. Boise State Public Radio and Idaho Matters are members of the NPR network. It's an independent coalition of public media podcasters. You can find more shows in the network wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Gemma Gaudette. We'll see you tomorrow.
The candidates for November are set.
I know Donald Trump's type.
Between now and Election Day,
we are not going back.
A campaign season unfolding faster.
Kamala Harris is not getting a promotion
Than any in recent history.
Make America great again.
Follow it all with new episodes every weekday on the NPR Politics Podcast.